Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. A few years ago, I came across a story online that stuck with me long after I finished reading it. It was one of those strange internet stories that seemed halfway between a mystery and an urban legend. I've tried to find it again several times since then, but I've never been able to locate the exact article or discussion where I first read it. Still, the story itself was so unusual that the details stayed with me. The story began with a rumor spreading around the internet about a mysterious online quiz. At first, it didn't seem very special. The internet has always been full of puzzles, riddles, scavenger hunts, and strange challenges designed to test people's intelligence or curiosity. Sometimes they are created for fun, sometimes as marketing campaigns, and sometimes just as strange experiments by people who enjoy creating complicated riddles. But this one was different. According to the story, someone had created an online quiz that supposedly led to a hidden treasure. The claim was that somewhere in the world there was a large amount of money hidden at a secret location, and the only way to find it was by solving the puzzle. The quiz itself wasn't simple. It wasn't the kind of puzzle you could solve in a few minutes or even a few hours. It was a long and complicated sequence of riddles, clues, and coded messages that required serious effort to understand. Some clues pointed toward obscure historical references, while others required knowledge of cryptography, geography, or logic puzzles. Because of that complexity, most people who looked at the quiz quickly gave up. The internet is full of difficult puzzles, but this one seemed especially frustrating. For a long time, no one could solve it. People posted about it on forums and discussion boards, but the puzzle remained unsolved. Then, eventually, one person managed to crack it. The story said that a man somewhere online had figured out the solution to the first puzzle. After weeks of studying the clues and trying different interpretations, he finally arrived at an answer that pointed him to a specific location. According to the instructions, that location was where the treasure was hidden. Naturally, he decided to go check it out. When he arrived at the location, however, he didn't find any treasure. Instead, he found another puzzle. Apparently, the person who created the quiz had hidden another set of clues there, leading to a second challenge that needed to be solved before the treasure could be found. At that point, the whole thing became even stranger. Instead of giving up, the man continued following the puzzle. He solved the second set of riddles and discovered another location. When he traveled there, he found yet another puzzle waiting for him. The process repeated itself several times. Each time he thought he was close to the final reward, another challenge appeared. The puzzles became increasingly complicated, sometimes taking him weeks to solve before he could move on to the next stage. What made the story even more interesting was that the man began documenting his journey online. He created videos explaining how he solved each puzzle and posted them on YouTube. In those videos, he would break down the clues step by step, showing viewers how he interpreted the riddles and how he figured out the correct answers. Some puzzles involved decoding hidden messages buried in strange images or text files. Others required researching obscure information, that most people would never think to look up. The videos gained a small following. People began watching his progress and trying to solve the puzzles alongside him. Some viewers even tried to reach the locations themselves before he did, hoping they might find the treasure first. But according to the story, the man always stayed ahead. Every time he solved a puzzle, he would post a video explaining the process and then travel to the next location. Sometimes the locations were in different cities. Sometimes they were in remote areas that required long trips to reach. The entire journey became something like a real-life treasure hunt. As the puzzles continued, the challenges became harder and stranger. Some clues required advanced problem-solving skills, while others seemed to rely on creative thinking and unusual connections between unrelated topics. Weeks turned into months. The man kept solving each puzzle, one after another, slowly moving closer to what he believed was the final reward. Eventually, he reached what appeared to be the last puzzle. After solving the final set of clues, he discovered a pair of coordinates. According to the puzzle, those coordinates pointed to the exact location where the treasure had finally been hidden. The coordinates led to an open field. Before traveling there, he uploaded another video. In the video, he explained that he believed he had finally reached the end of the puzzle sequence. He showed the coordinates and talked about his plan to travel to the location and dig up the treasure. The video was recorded casually. He was sitting on a train with a shovel beside him, clearly excited about what he might find. After spending so much time solving puzzles, he was convinced that he was finally about to claim the reward. He posted the video and headed toward the coordinates. According to the story I read, that was the last video he ever uploaded. The next day, something disturbing appeared in a local newspaper. A short article reported that a man had been found dead in an open field. The location mentioned in the report matched the coordinates he had shared in his video. The story didn't give many details. It simply said that the man had been killed. After that, the trail of information seemed to disappear. People online began speculating about what had really happened. Some believed the entire puzzle had been some kind of elaborate trap created by a disturbed individual. And others argued that the story might not have been real at all and could have been a fictional internet legend that spread across forums and websites. Some people even tried searching for the videos he supposedly posted, but many claimed they could no longer find them. That uncertainty made the story even more unsettling. Was it a real event involving a dangerous person who created the puzzle? Was it an exaggerated rumor that grew more dramatic each time someone retold it? Or was it simply a fictional story that had been written to scare people? No one seemed to know for sure. But the idea behind it stayed in my mind. A mysterious puzzle, a hidden treasure, a long journey of solving clues across different locations, and a final destination that ended not with money, but with something far darker. Whether the story was true or not, it felt like the kind of unsettling mystery that could easily take on a life of its own on the internet. And even today, I still occasionally wonder if anyone ever managed to find the truth behind it. When I was younger, I had an experience that still gives me chills when I think back on it. It happened one night at my dad's girlfriend's house. Her name was Susan, and she lived outside of town on a large piece of land. The property was quiet and peaceful most of the time, but it was also very isolated. There were no houses close by, and once the sun went down, the area became incredibly dark and silent. To give a better picture of the place, Susan's house sat in the middle of a wide stretch of land with trees scattered around the property. There were open areas of grass and dirt paths leading toward the edges of the land. During the day, it was beautiful, with plenty of room to walk around and enjoy being outdoors. At night, though, the isolation made everything feel different. When darkness settled over the property, there were no streetlights or nearby buildings casting any glow across the land. The sky was usually full of stars, but the ground itself was often covered in deep shadows. Sounds traveled easily through the quiet, and even small noises could seem strangely loud. One evening, we decided to have a bonfire out near the edge of the property. Bonfires were something we did occasionally when the weather was nice. We would gather around the fire pit, sit on logs or folding chairs, and spend time talking while the flames crackled and sparks floated up into the night sky. That particular night felt normal and relaxed. Everyone was gathered around the fire, enjoying the warmth and the quiet atmosphere. I remember bringing my iPod with me and spending part of the evening leaning against a nearby tree while listening to music. The tree stood a short distance from the fire pits, close enough that I could still see everyone sitting around the flames. Every once in a while, I would glance over at the fire, watching the orange glow flicker across the faces of the people sitting around it. Eventually, I got tired of sitting alone and walked back toward the group so I could warm up by the fire again. At some point during the evening, I must have leaned the iPod against the tree or set it down at the base of it. I didn't think much about it at the time. The night continued like most bonfire nights do. We talked, laughed, and watched the fire slowly burn lower as the hours passed. Eventually, the flames died down to glowing embers, and everyone started heading back toward the house to get some sleep. By the time we went inside, it was already pretty late. Everyone settled into their rooms, and the house quickly became quiet. At some point during the night, I suddenly woke up. When I looked at the clock, it was around 2 a.m. For a moment, I just lay there trying to figure out why I had woken up. Then I remembered something that made me sit up in bed immediately. My iPod. I had left it out by the tree near the bonfire pit. At first, I thought about ignoring it until morning. But then I worried that the dew might damage it or that it could get lost somewhere in the grass. The bonfire pit wasn't terribly far from the house. It was about a 5-minute walk across the property, so I decided I would just go out quickly, grab it, and come back inside. I quietly got out of bed and stepped outside the house. The moment I walked out into the night air, I noticed how incredibly dark everything was. The fire had completely burned out, leaving the area with almost no light at all. The only faint glow came from the moon and the stars overhead. I started walking across the property toward the bonfire pit. Susan had a dog named Shadow who stayed in a large cage near the fire pit area. He was a big dog and usually pretty protective of the property, especially at night. As I walked closer, I could see the outline of the cage sitting near the edge of the clearing. The ground around the bonfire pit was dark, and without a flashlight, it was difficult to see clearly. I moved slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness as much as possible. When I reached the tree where I had been sitting earlier, I realized just how little I could see. The iPod was small and dark, and it blended easily with the ground and fallen leaves around the base of the tree. So I crouched down and started feeling around with my hands. I ran my fingers across the dirt and grass, searching carefully around the base of the tree. While I was doing that, I suddenly heard Shadow start to growl. The sound came from the cage a short distance away. At first, I assumed he just didn't recognize me in the darkness, so I spoke to him softly, saying his name and letting him hear my voice. After a moment, the growling stopped. He must have realized it was someone familiar. I went back to feeling around near the tree until finally my hand touched something smooth and plastic. My iPod. Relieved, I picked it up and stood back up. I pressed the button to see if it would still turn on. The screen lit up faintly in the darkness, confirming that it was still working. At that exact moment, Shadow started growling again. This time, the sound was deeper and more intense. Something about the way he growled made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I looked up from the iPod, and that's when I saw him. Standing next to the tree, only an arm's length away from me, was a man. I had no idea how long he had been there. The darkness had hidden him completely, while I was crouched on the ground searching for my iPod. For a split second, my brain couldn't even process what I was seeing. He was standing there quietly, watching me, and smiling. The smile was the most disturbing part. It wasn't friendly or reassuring. It looked strange and unsettling in the dim light. The shock hit me all at once. I stumbled backward and fell onto the ground. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. The man didn't move. He just stood there looking down at me. Then he spoke. In a quiet, low whisper, he said one word. Hi. That was all. Just hi. But the way he said it made the moment feel even more terrifying. I didn't say anything back. I scrambled to my feet as fast as I could and started running toward the house. I ran as hard as I could without even thinking about looking back. The darkness around me felt thick and heavy as I sprinted across the property. Behind me, I suddenly heard Shadow barking and growling wildly from his cage. The dog sounded furious. His barking echoed through the quiet night as I kept running. I didn't slow down until I reached the house. I burst through the door and ran straight to my dad's room. He woke up immediately when I rushed in, and I tried to explain what had just happened as quickly as possible. My words came out rushed and frantic. I told him there had been a man standing out by the tree, only a few feet away from me. My dad grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check the area. I stayed inside, still shaking from what had just happened. After a while, he came back and said he hadn't found anyone out there. The property was quiet again. Still, the situation was serious enough that we called the police to report it. They came out to take a look around the area, but they didn't find any sign of the man either. Whoever he was had disappeared into the darkness. Even though nothing else happened that night, the experience stayed with me for a long time. Every once in a while, I still think about how close that man had been standing to me without making a sound. And I always come back to the same thought. If Shadow hadn't started growling when he did, I might not have looked up at the right moment, and I still wonder what could have happened if I hadn't realized someone was standing there. A few years ago, when I was younger, I went on a weekend trip to a lake in Texas with a group of friends. At the time, I was dating someone who is now my ex-girlfriend, and she came along with us. It was one of those spontaneous trips people plan when everyone is free and just wants to get away from the city for a couple of days. We left early Friday morning. I remember waking up before sunrise, throwing some clothes and camping gear into the car, and meeting the rest of the group at a gas station on the edge of town. Everyone was in a good mood. Road trips always bring that kind of energy where people are laughing, sharing snacks, and blasting music while the sun slowly rises outside the windows. The drive to the lake was about 4 hours. At first, the road took us through familiar towns and highways, but eventually the scenery started changing. The towns became smaller and farther apart. Gas stations and restaurants became harder to find. Eventually, we were driving through long stretches of quiet countryside, where it felt like there were more fields and trees than people. I had never been to that lake before, so I didn't really know what to expect. One of my friends had suggested it because he said it was a great place for cliff diving and camping. None of us really asked many questions. We just wanted a weekend outdoors. But as we kept driving deeper into rural Texas, it slowly became clear that this place was really out in the middle of nowhere. Eventually, we turned off the main highway onto a narrow road that wound through hills and trees. After another 30 minutes or so, the road opened up and we finally saw the lake. It was beautiful. The water stretched out wide and calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Large rocky cliffs rose up along parts of the shoreline, and there were several camp areas scattered around the edges of the lake. When we arrived, we spent a little time exploring the area to decide where to set up camp. One side of the lake had more developed camping spots. There were lights, power hookups, and a few buildings that looked like they had proper bathrooms and running water. The other side of the lake was much more primitive. That side had no electricity at all, no lights, just a few basic camping areas and some old outhouse-style restrooms. Of course, being a group of young people looking for a bit of adventure, we chose the primitive side. It felt more like real camping. We set up our tents not too far from the water and spent most of the day just enjoying the lake. Some of the guys went cliff diving from the rocks. Others stayed closer to the shore, swimming or floating around in the water. We brought a portable grill and spent the afternoon cooking burgers and hot dogs while music played from someone's speaker. The whole day had that carefree feeling that comes when you're far away from responsibilities and surrounded by friends. As the sun started setting, the sky turned shades of orange and pink over the lake. The temperature cooled down slightly, and a calm quiet settled over the area. When darkness finally arrived, things changed. Without electricity or lights on that side of the lake, the darkness became incredibly deep. The only light came from the stars overhead and the small glow from our campfire. Beyond that circle of firelight, everything was black. At some point later that night, two of our friends decided they wanted some privacy in their tent. Rather than awkwardly hanging around nearby, my girlfriend and I decided to go for a walk. She mentioned that she needed to use a restroom anyway, and we remembered that the other side of the lake had proper bathroom facilities. So we grabbed a flashlight and started walking along the trail that circled part of the lake. The walk took a little while, but eventually we reached the other campground area. Compared to where we had been staying, this side felt almost luxurious. There were actual restroom buildings with lights, sinks, and stalls. The building itself was small and square, made of old white brick that looked faded and worn by years of weather. The paint had chipped in places, and the bricks had that slightly warped look that old buildings sometimes get after decades in the sun. The lighting around the building wasn't great. Most of the area was still dark, and the only strong light came from a flickering, fluorescent bulb inside the women's restroom. The light buzzed softly and flickered in that uneven way fluorescent lights sometimes do when they're getting old. The men's restroom was on the opposite side of the small building. Standing there looking at it, the whole place felt a little unsettling. It was extremely quiet. No other campers seemed to be around at that moment, and the surrounding woods made the silence feel even deeper. My girlfriend walked toward the entrance to the women's restroom, while I stayed just outside. Before she went in, I glanced inside quickly to make sure no one else was there. From where I stood, it looked empty, or at least I thought it did. She stepped inside, but only for a second. Almost immediately, she stepped back out again. Her face looked uneasy. She said she thought she heard something inside. At first, I assumed maybe it was just the sound of pipes or water running somewhere in the building. Old restrooms sometimes make strange noises, especially at night. But she seemed genuinely uncomfortable. So I stepped closer to the doorway to check. The stalls inside had walls that stopped a little above the floor, so you could see the ground underneath them. I bent down slightly and looked across the floor to see if anyone was actually in there. That's when I noticed something. Under one of the stall doors, I saw a pair of large, muddy work boots. They were big boots, the kind construction workers or laborers often wear. Thick leather, heavy soles, and covered in dried mud. For a split second, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone had used the women's restroom because the men's side was out of order. But then I noticed something strange. The boots weren't positioned in front of the toilet the way someone's feet normally would be. They were turned sideways, facing the stall door, and positioned beside the toilet instead. The position looked unnatural, almost like the person inside was standing in an odd position or pressed against the side of the stall. Before I could even say anything, everything exploded into motion. The stall door slammed open with incredible force. Whoever was inside started screaming loudly in a way that made absolutely no sense. The sounds weren't words, at least not words I could recognize. It sounded like shouting or yelling in some strange, chaotic rhythm. It was loud, sudden, and completely terrifying. I never even saw the person's face. The moment the door burst open and the screaming started, pure adrenaline kicked in. My girlfriend and I both turned and ran. I don't think I have ever run that fast in my life. We sprinted away from that building, back down the trail toward our campsite. Not stopping or even looking behind us, our footsteps pounded against the dirt path while our flashlights bounced wildly in our hands. The darkness around us felt thicker than ever as we ran through it. Eventually, we reached the area where our friends were still sitting around the fire. Out of breath and completely shaken, we tried to explain what had just happened. To this day, I still don't know who that person was or why they were hiding in the stall like that. Maybe it was just some strange camper trying to scare people. Maybe it was someone who had been drinking too much and acting weird. But whatever the reason was, that moment in the dim, flickering bathroom was one of the most terrifying surprises I've ever experienced. And I don't think I've ever sprinted away from something faster in my life. I lived in the same house from the time I was just a few months old until I was around 15 or 16. It was the only home I really knew during my childhood. The house itself was old, built sometime in the early 1900s, but my parents had worked hard to remodel it over the years. They updated the floors, repainted the walls, and fixed a lot of the small details that tend to wear out in older houses. By the time I was old enough to remember things clearly, the place looked warm and comfortable, even though the bones of the house were still very old. It wasn't a big house. It only had 2 bedrooms, a small living room, a kitchen, and a basement. My parents took the larger bedroom, and my younger sister and I shared the second one. Our room was pretty small, so to save space, we had a bunk bed pushed up against one of the walls. I slept on the top bunk while my sister had the bottom. Growing up there always felt normal at the time, but looking back now, there were certain things about that house that felt strange. One of the biggest things I remember is that I used to wake up in the middle of the night almost every single night. It didn't matter what time I went to bed. I would fall asleep like anyone else, but at some random point in the night, I would suddenly wake up. Sometimes it would be midnight. Other times, it might be 2 or 3 in the morning. There didn't seem to be any pattern to it. At the time, I didn't really question it. Kids wake up at night sometimes, and I just assumed that was normal. Usually, I would just lie there quietly for a few minutes until I felt sleepy again, and then drift back off. But there was another feeling that came along with those nights. Almost every time I woke up, I had this strong sense that I wasn't alone. It's hard to explain exactly what that feeling was like. Nothing obvious was happening around me. The room would look exactly the way it always did. My sister would be sleeping quietly below me in the bottom bunk. The door would be slightly open, letting in a faint bit of light from the hallway. Everything looked normal. But deep down, I always had the feeling that someone was there. The same strange feeling sometimes happened during the day, too. For example, when I was in the shower, I often felt like someone was standing in the bathroom with me. Even though I knew the door was closed and no one had come in, I would occasionally peek out from behind the shower curtain just to check. Every time I looked, the room would be empty. Still, the feeling never completely went away. Most of the time, I ignored it and went on with my day. When you grow up in a place for a long time, strange little habits can start to feel normal. The experience that stands out the most happened when I was around 11 or 12 years old. It was a night just like many others. I had gone to bed in my bunk bed and fallen asleep normally. At some point later in the night, I woke up again like I usually did. The room was dark and quiet. I lay there on the top bunk, staring at the ceiling for a moment while I waited for sleep to come back. That was something I had done many times before. After a minute or two, I turned my head slightly and looked toward the closet. That's when I saw it. Standing near the closet was a figure. At first, my mind struggled to understand what I was seeing. The room was dim, so the shape looked almost like part of the darkness itself. But as my eyes adjusted, I could clearly make out the outline of something tall and thin, standing only a few feet away. For years, I described it as looking like a monk. The shape appeared to be wearing some kind of dark cloak that covered its entire body. The cloak hung down loosely, making the figure look long and narrow. Its face wasn't clear. It looked more like a shadow than an actual person. Now that I'm older and have thought about it many times, I think a better description might be what people sometimes call a shadow figure. But when I was a kid, the closest thing I could compare it to was a monk. The figure stood about 3 feet away from my bed, right near the closet door. What happened next felt strange, but oddly calm at the same time. The figure slowly raised one arm and pointed toward the window in our bedroom. The window was the only one in the room, positioned on the wall across from the bunk bed. The figure lifted its arm and pointed toward it. Then it lowered its arm. Then it pointed again. It repeated the motion several times, almost like it was trying to show me something. At the time, I didn't feel the kind of fear you might expect in that moment. I mostly just watched it, confused and half asleep. After a few seconds, the figure suddenly turned and moved toward the bedroom door. The door was open that night, and beyond it was the living room where my mom was sleeping on the couch. The figure slipped through the doorway and disappeared into the living room. After that, everything went quiet again. I remember lying there for a moment, wondering what I had just seen. But eventually I drifted back to sleep and didn't think too much about it the next day. The following night, something happened that made the experience even stranger. Once again, I woke up in the middle of the night, just like before. And once again, when I looked toward the closet, the same figure was standing there. It looked exactly the same as the night before. Tall, thin, dark. And once again, it raised its arm and pointed toward the window several times. I watched it carefully this time, remembering what had happened the previous night. Then it suddenly turned and moved toward the bedroom door. But this time, the door was closed. Instead of opening it, the figure simply moved straight through it. The shape passed directly through the closed door and disappeared into the living room on the other side. I never saw the figure again after those 2 nights. But strange things continued to happen in that house from time to time. One example involved the basement. Our computer was kept down there, so I often went downstairs to use it. The basement door had a habit of locking easily. Sometimes it would close behind you and the latch would click into place, even if you hadn't meant to shut it. That meant I occasionally ended up accidentally locked in the basement. Usually when that happened, I would walk up the stairs and wait near the door until someone upstairs noticed and opened it. One time I remember standing there on the landing at the top of the basement stairs after the door had locked again. The house was quiet. As I waited, I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. They sounded like someone walking slowly up the basement stairs. At first I thought maybe one of my parents had come downstairs. But when I turned around, there was no one there. The basement behind me was completely empty. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. That house seemed to hold many moments like that. Little things that were difficult to explain. Before we eventually moved away, something else came up that made those experiences feel even stranger. A family acquaintance once mentioned that his aunt and uncle had lived in our house many years earlier. During the conversation, he casually told us that his uncle had died in the living room, the same living room where the figure had disappeared on those 2 nights. I don't know if that information had anything to do with what I experienced. It could have been nothing more than coincidence. But hearing it definitely made the story feel more eerie. What stands out the most to me now is what happened after we moved away from that house. Once we settled into our new home, something changed. I stopped waking up in the middle of the night. The strange feeling of being watched disappeared completely. Even when I'm home alone now, I never feel like someone is standing nearby or observing me. And since leaving that old house, I've never experienced anything unusual like those events again. Sometimes I think back on those 2 nights when I saw that strange figure standing near the closet. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the imagination of a half-asleep kid in an old house. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Either way, those memories remain tied to that house and that time in my life. And the strangest part is that the moment we moved away, everything stopped. When I was in the 2nd grade, something happened at school that stayed with me for years. At the time, I was still very young, so some parts of the memory feel a little blurry now. But the main moment is something I can still picture very clearly. It was one of those experiences that a kid doesn't really know how to process. And because of that, it stuck in my mind for a long time. It was near the end of the school year, when things at school start to feel a little more relaxed. Teachers are finishing grades, students are excited about summer break, and there's a sense that the year is winding down. That particular day, there was some kind of small celebration happening for the students. From what I remember, many of the teachers were inside the school building. There was a going-away party happening for the students as the school year was coming to an end. Some teachers had stayed outside to supervise the kids who wanted to spend time on the playground instead of going inside. Normally, the playground area was always watched carefully. Teachers would stand around the yard talking with each other, but still keeping an eye on everything. But that day, things felt different. Maybe the teachers inside needed help with the party. Or maybe some of the teachers who were supposed to be watching outside decided to step away for a few minutes. Either way, there was a large section of the schoolyard that suddenly had no adults watching it. Of course, none of us kids really noticed that right away. For us, it just felt like another day outside during recess. I had been somewhere else on the playground for a little while before this happened. I remember walking across part of the schoolyard and turning a corner near the side of the building. At that age, you don't really think much about what's happening around the corner. You just wander wherever you feel like going. As I walked around that corner, I suddenly stepped into something chaotic. A group of kids had started throwing rocks at each other. Not just 1 or 2 kids messing around. It was more like a full-on rock fight. The only way I can describe it is that it looked like a food fight, except instead of throwing food, kids were throwing rocks. Looking back now as an adult, it sounds unbelievable. But kids can make bad decisions quickly when there's no one around to stop them. From what I could tell, the rock throwing had already been going on for a little while before I got there. But by the time I rounded the corner, it seemed like the fight was already starting to break up. Some kids were running away from the area. Others were shouting or looking around nervously, like they suddenly realized how bad the situation had gotten. I had only taken a few steps forward when something happened that froze me in place. One of the kids suddenly ran past me. At first, I didn't even understand what I was looking at. But then my brain processed it, and the image became something I would never forget. The side of the child's head was badly injured. A large part of the skull had been smashed open. There was blood running down the side of their face and onto their clothes. Pieces of what looked like bone and other matter were visible, and there was blood on the ground where the child had been standing moments before. Even now, it's hard to describe exactly how shocking that moment was. For a second, I didn't even move. I just stood there watching as the injured child ran past me. Despite the injury, the child was still moving, still running. They ran around the same corner that I had just come from, heading back toward the part of the playground where the teachers were. I could hear shouting starting almost immediately after. Teachers began yelling, their voices filled with panic as they realized something terrible had happened. Other kids were crying or shouting as well. The calm playground had suddenly turned into a scene of complete chaos. At that age, I didn't really understand how serious the injury was or what exactly had happened. I only knew that what I had seen looked incredibly frightening. Blood was on the ground where the child had been moments earlier. The image of the injury stayed in my mind in a way that made it hard to think about anything else. I remember feeling frozen for a moment before slowly backing away from the area. Soon, teachers and other adults rushed toward the injured child. Someone must have called emergency services because within a short time, adults were everywhere, trying to control the situation and keep the other students away. For the rest of the day, the school felt completely different, and teachers were speaking in hushed voices. Kids were whispering to each other about what had happened. No one really knew the full story, but everyone knew that something serious had taken place. Because I was only in second grade, the adults didn't explain much to us. Most of the information I heard came later from other students or from bits of conversation that I overheard. Apparently, the injury had happened during the rock fight when one of the rocks struck the child directly in the head. The force of the impact caused a severe skull fracture. At the time, it was terrifying to think about. For weeks afterward, the image of that moment stayed in my mind. Every now and then it would pop back into my thoughts unexpectedly. As a kid, you don't really know how to deal with seeing something like that. It wasn't something I could easily forget. Even though the memory was disturbing, there was one piece of news that eventually made the situation a little easier to process. The child survived. Despite the seriousness of the injury, doctors were able to save their life. The recovery was long and difficult, but over time they managed to heal. From what I later heard, the child had a large metal plate placed in their skull during surgery to repair the damage. There was also skin grafting involved to help heal the injured area. But the important thing was that they lived. Years later, I heard that they were doing well and had gone on to live a normal life. Knowing that made the memory slightly less painful. Even so, the moment itself never completely faded from my mind. It was one of those childhood experiences that showed me, at a very young age, how quickly things can go wrong when people aren't careful. Kids often don't understand the danger of the things they're doing until something serious happens. That day on the playground was a perfect example of that. What started as a moment of careless behavior turned into something that could have easily ended in tragedy. And even though the child survived and eventually recovered, the image of that moment stayed with me for a long time afterward. It was one of the first times in my life that I realized just how fragile people can be, and how quickly an ordinary day can turn into something unforgettable. This is a story that was told to me many years ago by the father of a friend of mine. I remember the first time I heard it because of the way he told it. He wasn't trying to scare anyone, and he didn't tell it like a campfire ghost story. Instead, he spoke about it very calmly, almost like he was recalling a strange memory from his childhood that he still couldn't fully explain. According to him, the events happened when he was very young, somewhere around 7 or 8 years old. At that age, children often spend a lot of time exploring the area around their homes, especially if they live somewhere with open land or woods nearby. That was exactly the kind of environment he grew up in. His family lived close to a forested area where the trees stretched out for miles. It was the kind of place where kids could wander around for hours, climbing over rocks, crossing small streams, and pretending they were on some kind of adventure. For him and his cousin, the woods had always been a playground. They spent many afternoons there after school. One particular day, the two of them decided to go walking deeper into the forest than they normally did. They weren't really looking for anything specific. Like most kids that age, they were just exploring and seeing what they could find. The forest around them was quiet and peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the leaves overhead, creating patches of light and shadow across the ground. The air smelled like damp soil and plants, and every now and then they could hear birds moving through the trees. As they walked along one of the small trails, something unusual caught their attention. Not far ahead of them, between the trees, they saw a small figure moving around. At first, they couldn't quite tell what they were looking at. The figure was much shorter than an adult, but it didn't move like a child either. Curious, they walked a little closer to get a better look. That's when they saw it clearly. Standing there among the trees was a very small man. According to the way my friend's father described him, the figure looked almost exactly like the dwarfs from old fairy tales. He said the man was short, with clothing that looked old-fashioned, and he was wearing a pointed hat that reminded them of the kind you see in the story of Snow White. The sight of him was so strange that the boys didn't know how to react at first. The small man stood there staring directly at them. He didn't say anything. He just watched them. At that age, children sometimes react to unusual situations in unpredictable ways. Instead of running away or calling for help, the two boys decided to do something that's, looking back, probably wasn't the smartest idea. They started throwing small rocks at him. The first few rocks didn't come very close, but they seemed to get the man's attention. When one rock landed nearby, the small figure suddenly turned and ran away. But he didn't run very far. After a short distance, he stopped and turned around again. Then he stood there, staring at them once more. The boys thought the whole thing was funny. They ran forward a little, picking up more rocks and tossing them in his direction. Each time they got close enough for the rocks to reach him, he would run away again. But every time he stopped, he would turn back and look at them. Sometimes he even laughed. And the boys continued following him deeper through the forest like that for quite a while. Whenever they got close enough to throw rocks, he would move farther away, always staying just out of reach. Eventually, the small man led them toward a river that ran through that part of the forest. The river wasn't very wide, but it was deep enough that the boys couldn't easily cross it without getting wet. The water moved steadily over rocks and branches, creating a soft rushing sound. The small man ran across the river to the other side and stopped there. Now he stood safely out of reach. The boys tried throwing rocks again, but none of them came close enough to hit him. That's when something changed. Instead of just staring at them, the small man began making gestures with his hand. He waved his arm slowly, signaling for them to come closer. Then he spoke. He called out to them in Spanish, repeating the same words over and over again. Vengan, vengan, which means come here, come here. He kept making the gesture with his hand, inviting them to cross the river and follow him. At that moment, the boys finally started to feel unsure about the situation. They were tired from chasing him through the forest, and it was beginning to get late in the day. The sunlight was fading slowly, and the woods were starting to grow darker. After a while, they decided they had had enough. Instead of crossing the river, they turned around and began walking back toward home. As they left, they looked back one last time. The small man stood there on the other side of the river watching them. Then he suddenly turned and disappeared into the forest. When the boys arrived home, they immediately told the story to their grandmother. They described the strange little man in the woods, the pointed hat, and the way he had kept calling them to cross the river. Instead of laughing or dismissing the story, their grandmother became extremely upset. She began scolding them loudly. The reason for her reaction became clear very quickly. The river they had been standing beside was known in the area for being dangerous. Over the years, several children had drowned there. Hearing that the boys had been tempted to cross the river by a strange man in the woods frightened her deeply. She believed they had narrowly avoided something terrible. The story might have ended there, but several years later, something happened that made the memory even stranger. By that time, the boys were older, and one day they were walking through the same area again with one of their aunts. The three of them were following a trail along the edge of the forest. Everything seemed normal at first, but then something unusual happened. Without saying anything, their aunt suddenly began drifting away from the path. She walked slowly toward the trees as if she had noticed something interesting deeper in the forest. The boy's mother called out to her, asking where she was going, but the aunt didn't respond. She just kept walking farther into the woods. At first, it seemed like she hadn't heard them. But even when they called her name again, she continued moving forward without turning around. Eventually, the mother hurried after her and grabbed her by the shoulders. She shook her gently and asked what she was doing. The aunt looked confused. Then she said something that made everyone pause. She explained that she had been following a small man. According to her, he had been standing among the trees, waving for her to come closer. She said he looked funny and strange, and that he kept calling her to follow him. But when the others asked where the man was, they couldn't see anyone at all. The aunt insisted he had been there only moments before. The mother dismissed the whole thing and told her she must have imagined it. But hearing that story later in life left a strong impression on my friend's father, because it sounded exactly like the strange little man he and his cousin had seen years earlier near the river. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. This happened in the late 1990s when I was still living in the Philippines. I was very young at the time, probably around 4 or 5 years old. Most of my memories from that age are scattered and hazy, but this particular story stayed with me clearly, partly because my family talked about it for years afterward. Back then, we lived in a modest house with a small yard. Like many homes in the Philippines, The house had wide windows to let in the breeze and a yard filled with tropical plants. There were banana trees, flowering plants, and one large mango tree that stood near the back corner of the property. The tree was tall and thick with leaves, and during the season it would produce dozens of mangoes that we would pick and eat. As a child, I spent a lot of time playing around the house and in the yard. My world at that age was simple. Toys, cartoons, small adventures in the backyard, and family gatherings were the things that filled my days. One day my uncle came to visit after returning from a trip overseas. He often brought little gifts when he traveled, usually small toys or trinkets he picked up at markets or flea markets. That day he handed me something unusual. It was a porcelain doll. Not the kind of doll most little kids would usually get. This one was dressed like a jester. The doll was small enough to hold easily in my hands. Its body was stiff and delicate, made of porcelain with painted details. The face was pale white with exaggerated makeup like a clown or circus performer. Thin red streaks were painted from above its eyebrows down toward its cheeks, giving it a strange expression that was half smiling and half unsettling. Its clothing was colorful, with the classic jester design, pointed shapes and bright colors sewn into a tiny outfit. The hat had little bells attached to the tips, although they didn't make much noise. Looking back now, it probably wasn't the kind of toy most parents would give a small child. But for some reason, I loved it. Children sometimes become attached to strange things, and that doll fascinated me. I thought it looked interesting and unique compared to my other toys. I remember carrying it around the house and talking to it, as if it were a friend. Eventually I gave it a name, though I can't remember what it was anymore. What I do remember is that I always wanted to keep the doll with me. Most of the time I would bring it upstairs to my room. At first, nothing seemed unusual about that. It was just a toy, and I was just a small kid who liked playing with it. But after a while, something strange started happening. Every time the doll came into my room, I would get sick. The first time it happened, my parents didn't think much about it. Children get sick all the time, especially at that age. A fever or cold wasn't anything unusual. But the pattern started repeating. Whenever I brought the doll upstairs and kept it in my room, I would soon come down with some kind of illness. Sometimes it was a fever. Sometimes I would feel weak or tired for no obvious reason. At first, it seemed like coincidence. But after several times, my mother began to notice the connection. My mom was a very superstitious person. In the Philippines, many families grow up hearing stories about spirits, curses, and strange objects that can carry bad energy. Whether you believe those stories or not, they are a big part of the culture. Eventually, my mom told me something very clearly. She said I was not allowed to bring the doll into my room anymore. According to her, the doll was the reason I kept getting sick. Of course, at 4 or 5 years old, I didn't fully understand what she meant. To me, it was just my toy. But I listened to her and left the doll downstairs with the other things in the living area. That should have been the end of it. But then something even stranger started happening. Despite leaving the doll downstairs, it kept appearing in my bedroom. I would go upstairs to play or sleep and suddenly see the jester doll sitting somewhere in the room. Sometimes it would be on a shelf. Other times it would be near my bed. And every time I saw it there, I knew I hadn't brought it upstairs. At that age, I assumed someone else must have moved it. Maybe one of my relatives or another family member had carried it upstairs as a joke. But when I told my mother, she insisted no one had touched it. I tried to explain to her that I hadn't moved it myself. But of course, I was just a small child. From her perspective, it probably seemed obvious that I had simply forgotten bringing the doll upstairs. Adults don't usually believe stories like that from a 5-year-old. So each time it appeared in my room, and my mom would scold me gently and tell me to stop bringing the doll upstairs. And each time, shortly after that, I would get sick again. The situation continued like that for a while. The doll would appear in my room. I would become ill. My mother would get more and more worried. Finally, the situation reached a point where she had had enough. One day, the doll appeared in my bedroom again, and shortly afterward, I came down with a severe case of measles. Oh, for those who haven't experienced it, measles can be a very serious illness, especially for young children. I had a high fever and had to stay in bed for days while my family took care of me. That was the moment my mother decided the doll had to go. She believed it was cursed. Whether that belief came from superstition or fear, I'm not sure. But she was completely convinced that the doll was the cause of the strange pattern of sickness. So she decided to get rid of it in the most final way she could think of. She burned it. I remember watching from a distance while she destroyed the doll in the yard. The porcelain cracked in the heat and the fabric clothing burned away. Afterward, she buried the remains near the large mango tree in our backyard. According to her, that would make sure the doll could never bother us again. And strangely enough, after that day, the problem stopped. I never saw the doll again. I also stopped getting those sudden, unexplained fevers. A few years later, our family moved away from that house. Eventually, we moved to the United States and started a completely new chapter of our lives. But every once in a while, when I think back to that time, the memory still feels eerie. Somewhere in that old yard in the Philippines, near a mango tree that might still be standing today, the remains of that strange porcelain jester doll could still be buried. And even now, I honestly don't know whether the doll was just a strange coincidence from childhood or something far more unsettling. Back in 2008, a few friends and I planned a trip that we had all been looking forward to for weeks. One of my buddies had access to a small cabin up north in Wisconsin, not far from the town of Merrill. It was the kind of quiet place people in Milwaukee often escaped to during long weekends when they wanted to get away from the noise of the city. Memorial Day weekend felt like the perfect time for it. The plan was simple. We would pile into one car, drive the 4 hours north, and spend the weekend relaxing by the lake, grilling food, and enjoying the start of summer. None of us expected the drive itself to become the part of the trip that we would still be talking about years later. Originally, we had hoped to leave the city sometime in the early evening. That would have put us on the highway before dark and allowed us to arrive at the cabin around midnight. But one of the guys coming with us had a rugby game that evening, and he insisted he couldn't miss it, and so the rest of us waited. By the time he finally finished the game, showered, and met up with us, it was already getting pretty late. We loaded our bags into the car, grabbed a few snacks for the road, and finally pulled out of Milwaukee. But when we checked the time, it was about 10 at night. At the beginning of the trip, everything felt normal. The city lights slowly faded behind us as we made our way onto the highway. Milwaukee at night has plenty of traffic and illumination, so the first part of the drive felt pretty familiar. But as we continued north, the environment started to change. The farther we drove away from the city, the fewer lights there were. Buildings became less frequent. Street lights disappeared. Eventually, the highway was surrounded mostly by farmland and stretches of trees. Wisconsin has a lot of open rural land, and once you're far enough from the cities, the darkness becomes surprisingly deep. The road we were on was Highway 29, which cuts across a large portion of the state. It's a wide 4-lane highway, and during the day, it's actually a pretty easy drive. There's not much scenery other than fields and occasional small towns. At night, though, it feels very different. Without city lights or constant traffic, the highway becomes incredibly dark. Your headlights only illuminate a small section of road ahead of you, and beyond that, everything disappears into blackness. I had done this drive a few times before during the daytime, but this was my first time making the trip that late at night. And the darkness was honestly surprising. Other than the occasional pair of headlights from another vehicle passing by, there was almost nothing to see. As the hours passed, we started to get a little restless. It was late, the road was long, and the scenery wasn't exactly exciting. To keep ourselves entertained, we started doing the only thing there really was to do: reading the road signs. It sounds ridiculous now, but when you're driving through a dark rural highway at 1 in the morning, even small distractions can feel entertaining. Every time we passed a sign, someone in the car would read it out loud. Sometimes it was just distance markers telling us how far we were from the next town. Other times it was warning signs about deer crossings or construction zones. By that point, we were about 3 hours into the drive. It had to be around 1 in the morning. The road ahead of us was almost completely empty. Then one of my friends suddenly read a sign out loud. The sign said something simple: "Watch for school buses." We laughed about it for a second because the idea seemed strange at that hour. It was the middle of the night on a rural highway. The chances of seeing a school bus out there at that time seemed almost non-existent. But what happened next made the laughter disappear instantly. Almost immediately after we passed the sign, something appeared on the road ahead of us. Out of the darkness, about 4 lanes ahead of where we were driving, 2 red brake lights suddenly came into view. They seemed to materialize out of nowhere. At first, we thought it was just another car, but as we got a little closer, the shape of the vehicle became clearer. It was a school bus. The bus was driving right in front of us on the highway. And the strange thing was that it seemed to be surrounded by a thick patch of fog. Not fog covering the whole highway, just fog around the bus itself. The rest of the road ahead of us looked perfectly clear. The moment we realized what we were looking at, the entire car erupted into chaos. Everyone started shouting at once. One of my friends yelled at me to pull over immediately. Another insisted that I should slow down and stay far behind it, while someone else was telling me to just drive past it and get away from it as quickly as possible. The sudden appearance of a school bus at 1 in the morning in the middle of a dark rural highway, surrounded by fog that didn't exist anywhere else, was enough to make all of us panic. After a few seconds of trying to decide what to do, I chose the option that seemed the simplest. I decided to pass it. One of my friends had already grabbed his camera and was trying to take pictures through the windshield. Everyone was still yelling different suggestions while I focused on the road ahead. But passing the bus turned out to be harder than expected. The bus was moving extremely fast, way faster than you would normally expect a school bus to travel. The speed limit on that stretch of highway was about 65 miles per hour. The bus had to be going at least 85. Every time I tried to accelerate enough to get around it, it kept matching the speed. The vehicle felt strangely aggressive on the road for something that large. Eventually, I managed to push the car faster and move into the passing lane. For a moment, we were driving right alongside the bus. The fog seemed thicker around it up close, almost swirling in the air around the sides of the vehicle. My friend continued snapping pictures as quickly as he could. Then finally, we pulled ahead of it. As soon as we were in front of the bus, I checked the rearview mirror. And that's when things got even stranger. The bus slowly drifted back into the darkness behind us. Within seconds, we couldn't see it anymore. No headlights, no fog, nothing. It was just gone. The highway behind us looked completely empty again. For the rest of the drive, the entire car was filled with nervous conversation. Everyone had their own theory about what we had just seen. Some thought it might have been a charter bus or some kind of transportation vehicle that just happened to look like a school bus in the dark. Others insisted that the fog around it had looked unnatural. Later on, when we finally reached the cabin, we decided to look up information about that stretch of highway. We searched for news about bus accidents or strange incidents along Highway 29. We didn't find anything about school buses specifically, but we did discover something interesting. The highway had a nickname. People often referred to it as Bloody 29. Apparently, over the years, there had been a large number of serious accidents along that road, enough that the nickname had stuck among locals. Even though we never found any explanation for the bus we saw that night, the experience stayed with all of us. The photos we took didn't show anything clearly paranormal. They mostly just captured a distant vehicle surrounded by a hazy cloud. But the memory of seeing that bus appear out of nowhere in the darkness of the highway, right after reading a sign warning us about school buses, is something none of us have ever forgotten. Even now, years later, it remains one of the strangest and most unsettling moments I've ever experienced on the road. When I was in school, I was part of the school band. Music had always been something I enjoyed, and joining the band was one of the best decisions I made during those years. Being part of a band meant a lot of early practices, concerts, and carrying around large instruments that most people didn't even know the names of. My instrument happened to be one of the biggest ones in the entire band. I played the tuba. Anyone who has ever seen a tuba up close knows just how massive it is. It's not something you casually carry around like a flute or trumpet. It's heavy, awkward, and incredibly large. Mine was especially old, too. The school had a few instruments that had clearly been passed down from student to student for years, and my tuba was one of those. The metal had darkened over time, and patches of rust showed through in certain places. Despite its worn appearance, it still worked perfectly fine. Because the instrument was so large, the band director allowed me to keep it at home for practice instead of carrying it back and forth every day. That meant my room had to make space for something almost as big as a small piece of furniture. The tuba usually stood in the corner of my room. I placed it upright, resting on its bell. The bell of a tuba is huge and wide, so when you stand it on that end, it actually becomes very stable. It's almost like placing a large metal cone on the floor. Once it's balanced properly, it's not easy for it to tip over on its own. At least that's what I always believed. My room itself was pretty normal. I had a bunk bed with a single mattress on the top where I slept. The lower bunk had been removed years earlier, so the space underneath was used for storage and other random things. In another corner of the room stood an old wooden wardrobe that had been there long before I moved in. The wardrobe always made me uncomfortable. It was one of those tall, heavy pieces of furniture with large doors that opened outward. The wood was dark and scratched from years of use. Something about it just gave me a strange feeling, especially at night. Because of that, I had developed a small habit. Every night before going to sleep, I would double-check that the wardrobe doors were completely closed. I didn't like the idea of them slowly creaking open in the middle of the night. Most of the time, nothing unusual happened. But one night, things changed. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. The room was dark except for a little light coming through the window from the street outside. The house was quiet, and everything felt normal. Then, suddenly, I heard a loud crash. The sound exploded through the room so suddenly that it made my whole body jolt. It sounded like something heavy had fallen over and slammed against the floor. My heart immediately started pounding. For a few seconds, I didn't move at all. I just lay there in my bed, staring into the darkness. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what could have made that noise, but I was too scared to look. Instead of getting up, I pulled my blanket up slightly and squeezed my eyes shut as tightly as I could. I remember lying there completely still, listening carefully for any other sound. But the room stayed quiet. The silence felt thick and uncomfortable. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. I was too nervous to fall asleep again and too afraid to climb down from the bed to check what had happened. Eventually the night passed and morning lights slowly began to fill the room. When I finally opened my eyes and looked around, the first thing I noticed made my stomach drop. My tuba was lying on its side. It was no longer standing upright in the corner where I had left it the night before. Instead, it had fallen over and was resting on the floor. Seeing it there made me feel confused. Tubas don't just fall over easily when they're balanced on their bell. They're big and surprisingly stable in that position. For it to fall, something would usually have to push it or knock into it. But there was no reason for that to have happened. Then I noticed something else. The wardrobe doors were open. Not slightly open. They were wide open. That made the situation even more unsettling. I clearly remembered closing those doors before going to sleep the night before. It was something I always made sure to do. Now both doors stood open as if someone had pulled them apart. I tried to think of logical explanations. Maybe the tuba had been slightly off balance and eventually tipped over during the night. Maybe the crash of it hitting the floor had somehow shaken the wardrobe doors open. But even as I told myself those things, they didn't feel very convincing. Still, the daylight made everything seem less frightening. And eventually, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I stood the tuba back up in its corner and closed the wardrobe doors again. That should have been the end of it. But the next night made everything much worse. That evening, I was home alone. My parents were out, and I knew for a fact that no one else was in the house. I had been studying in my room for a while, sitting at my desk with books spread out in front of me. The house was completely quiet. Then suddenly, I heard someone call my name. The voice came from downstairs. It wasn't faint or unclear. It sounded like someone had clearly spoken my name, almost as if they were calling me to come down. For a moment, I didn't even think about the fact that I was alone in the house. The voice sounded so real that my brain immediately reacted the way it normally would. I pushed my chair back and walked out of my room, heading toward the stairs to see who was calling me. I walked down into the lower level of the house, but when I got there, no one was there. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. The lights were off, and the house looked exactly the same as it had a few minutes earlier. I stood there for a moment, feeling confused. Then, slowly, I began walking back up the stairs. Halfway up the staircase, I heard another loud crash. It came from my room. My heart instantly jumped into my throat. For a moment, I just stood there frozen. Then fear quickly turned into something closer to adrenaline. I ran up the rest of the stairs as fast as I could. On the way, I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter without even thinking about it. By the time I reached my bedroom door, my heart was beating so hard, I could hear it in my ears. I pushed the door open quickly. Inside the room, the sight waiting for me stopped me cold. My tuba was on the floor again, just like the night before. And the wardrobe doors were swinging open. They moved slowly back and forth as if they had just been pushed apart moments earlier. I stood there in the doorway holding the knife, staring at the room in a complete disbelief. There was no one inside, no open windows, nothing that could explain how either of those things had just happened. The tuba, which had been standing upright earlier, had somehow fallen again, and the wardrobe doors, which I knew I had closed earlier that evening, were now open and still moving. I stayed in the doorway for a long moment, listening carefully for any sound. But the house was silent. That night was the last time anything like that happened. Nothing else strange ever occurred in my room after that. But the experience left a strong impression on me. Even now, years later, I still remember how unsettling it felt standing there, watching those wardrobe doors slowly swing open. After that night, I changed a few things about how I kept my room. I started tying the wardrobe doors shut with a piece of string before going to sleep, just to make sure they stayed closed. And I stopped standing the tuba upright in the corner. Instead, I laid it on its side where it couldn't possibly fall over. I also stopped playing that particular instrument altogether. Luckily, there was another tuba available at school that I could use during band practice, so I didn't need to keep the old one in my room anymore. To this day, I still don't know what caused those strange things to happen. But I've never forgotten the nights when my instrument seemed determined to make itself heard, even when I wasn't playing it. When I was in school, I was part of the band. Music had always been something I enjoyed, and being in the band felt like being part of a small team, where everyone had their own role. Some people played trumpets, some played clarinets or drums, and I ended up playing one of the biggest instruments in the entire room, the tuba. It was an old instrument that had clearly been used by many students before me. The metal had faded in places, and there were small patches of rust along the tubing where years of fingerprints and wear had taken their toll. It wasn't shiny like the newer instruments some of the other students had, but it still worked perfectly well. Because the instrument was so large and heavy, the school allowed certain band members to take their instruments home for practice instead of carrying them back and forth every day. My tuba was one of those instruments, so it stayed in my bedroom. My room wasn't particularly large, but I had found a good spot for the instrument in the corner near my wardrobe. The tuba was so big that the bell at the top could practically swallow your head if you leaned over it. When I stored it, I stood it upright on its bell in the corner. The bell was huge and flat enough that it made the instrument surprisingly stable. Once it was standing there, it didn't really wobble or move. At least, it never had before. The rest of my room was fairly simple. I had a bunk bed with only the bottom mattress used, a desk where I studied, a small bookshelf, and an old wardrobe that had been in the house long before I started using the room. That wardrobe always made me a little uneasy. There was nothing actually wrong with it. It was just an old piece of furniture with tall wooden doors that sometimes creaked when they opened. But for some reason, it always gave me a strange feeling when the doors were open at night. Because of that, I made it a habit to close them every evening before going to sleep. I didn't like the idea of those dark, empty spaces inside the wardrobe facing my bed in the middle of the night. One night, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. The room was quiet, and the lights were already off. The only sound in the house was the occasional creak that old houses tend to make when everything settles down for the night. I remember staring up at the ceiling and slowly drifting towards sleep. Then suddenly, there was an enormous crash. The sound exploded through the room so loudly that my entire body jumped. It sounded like something heavy had fallen and smashed into the floor. For a second, I didn't even understand what had happened. My heart started racing instantly, and every nerve in my body felt alert. The sound had definitely come from somewhere inside my room, but I was too scared to move. Instead of sitting up or turning on the light, I did the exact opposite. I squeezed my eyes shut as tightly as I could and stayed perfectly still under the covers. My mind started racing through possibilities. Maybe something had fallen off my desk. Maybe a book had slipped from the shelf. Maybe the house had shifted slightly and something had tipped over. But I couldn't bring myself to actually check. The room felt completely silent again after the crash, which somehow made it worse. I lay there, frozen in bed, listening for any other sounds. None came. Minutes passed. Then what felt like hours. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I thought about opening my eyes or getting out of bed, fear stopped me. I just stayed there waiting for the morning light to arrive. Eventually, the darkness outside my window began to fade, and pale daylight slowly filled the room. When I finally opened my eyes, the first thing I saw made my stomach drop. My tuba was lying on its side on the floor. The big instrument that had been standing upright in the corner was now stretched across the carpet like it had been pushed over. But that wasn't the only thing. The wardrobe doors were wide open, both of them. That alone made me uneasy because I knew for certain I had closed them before going to bed. I always did. Still, I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe the tuba had somehow lost its balance and tipped over during the night. Maybe when it fell, it had hit the wardrobe and caused the doors to swing open. It seemed unlikely, but it was the only explanation that made any sense. So I picked up the tuba, placed it back in its corner, closed the wardrobe doors again, and tried to forget about the whole thing. The next day went by normally. Nothing strange happened. But the following night, things got much worse. That evening, I was home alone. My parents were out, and I was in my room studying at my desk. The house was quiet except for the sound of pages turning and the occasional creak from the floorboards. After a while, I heard something that immediately grabbed my attention. Someone called my name. The voice came from downstairs. It wasn't faint or distant. It sounded exactly like someone standing somewhere in the house trying to get my attention. For a moment, I didn't even think about the fact that I was supposed to be alone. The voice sounded so real that my first instinct was simply to respond. I stood up and rushed out of my room, walking quickly down the stairs. But when I reached the bottom floor, the house was empty. There was no one in the kitchen, no one in the living room, no one anywhere. The silence in the house suddenly felt very heavy. I stood there for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. I was absolutely certain I had heard someone call my name. It hadn't sounded like imagination. It had sounded real. Eventually, I turned and started walking back upstairs. That's when I heard another crash. The sound came directly from my bedroom. It was just as loud as the one from the night before. My heart instantly started pounding. Someone was in my room. That was the only explanation my mind could come up with in that moment. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and slowly climbed the stairs. Every step felt heavy and tense. By the time I reached the hallway outside my room, my heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. I pushed the door open quickly. The sight inside made me freeze. My tuba was lying on the floor again, and the wardrobe doors were swinging back and forth slowly, as if they had just been thrown open. But there was no one in the room. No one hiding behind the door. No one crouched behind the desk. No one anywhere. The room was completely empty. I stood there gripping the knife, scanning every corner of the room, expecting someone to suddenly jump out. But nothing happened. Eventually, the wardrobe doors stopped moving. The room became silent again. That was the last time anything like that ever happened. But the experience left a strong impression on me. After that night, I stopped standing the tuba upright. I always laid it on its side instead so it couldn't fall over again. And I stopped trusting the wardrobe doors. Every night before going to sleep, I tied them shut with a piece of string so they couldn't open on their own. Even now, years later, I still remember the sound of those crashes and the sight of those doors swinging open. And even though I still played the tuba at school, I never played that one at home again. When my brother was very young, he used to have what my parents assumed was a normal imaginary friend. A lot of kids go through phases like that. They invent characters to play with, talk to them, give them names, and treat them like real companions. At first, my parents didn't think anything unusual about it. My brother was a creative kid and often spent time talking to himself while playing with toys, building little worlds on the floor of the living room or in his bedroom. According to my parents, he talked about this friend often. He would say he was playing with him, or that his friend had come over, or that they had gone somewhere together inside his imagination. My parents mostly just smiled about it and went along with it the way parents often do. It seemed harmless and even kind of sweet. My brother was older than me, so I was very little at the time. Most of what I know about those early years comes from stories my parents told me later. Eventually, after some time had passed, my parents realized something strange. My brother had stopped mentioning the imaginary friend completely. The conversations about him were gone. There were no more moments where he said he was playing with him or talking to him. At first, they didn't notice right away. But after a while, it became clear that the friend had simply disappeared from my brother's life. One day, my parents casually asked him about it. They asked him what had happened to his friend and whether he still played with him sometimes. My brother's response surprised them. He told them they weren't friends anymore. Then he refused to say anything else. Whenever they tried to ask more questions, he would change the subject or say he didn't want to talk about it. My parents didn't push him too hard. They assumed he had simply grown out of the imaginary friend phase and that his answer was just the way a child explained it. For a while, things seemed normal. Then something else started happening. Not long after the imaginary friend disappeared, my brother began having terrible night terrors. These weren't ordinary nightmares. They were intense episodes where he would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, terrified and crying. My parents would rush into his room to calm him down, but he would be shaking and pointing toward the darkness of the room. Whenever they asked what was wrong, he kept saying the same thing. He said the man in the black hat was coming to hurt him. And he said the man was coming to hurt me too. I was very young at the time, so I didn't understand any of this when it was happening. But my parents later explained that my brother was absolutely convinced that someone was coming into the house at night. When my parents tried to calm him down, they would ask who he was talking about. And that's when something else became unsettling. My brother described the man in the black hat exactly the same way he had once described his imaginary friend. The connection made my parents uncomfortable. Still, they tried to stay rational about it. Children's imaginations can be powerful, especially when they're frightened or half asleep. They hoped the phase would pass. But then another problem appeared. A few months after the night terrors started, my brother began getting severe migraines. The headaches were intense and frequent enough that my parents became very worried. There was a particular reason for their concern. My dad had lost his younger brother when he was only 5 years old due to brain cancer. Because of that family history, my father didn't want to take any chances with my brother's health. So they started taking him to doctors. He went through all kinds of medical tests, Doctors ran MRI scans, CT scans, and other examinations to check if there was anything physically wrong with him. Every test came back normal. There was no medical explanation for the migraines or the night terrors. Eventually, after several months, both the migraines and the night terrors stopped. Just like that, my brother went back to being a normal kid again. And nothing bad ever happened to me. For a while, life returned to normal. Then, a few years later, something else began happening in the house. By that point, we had gotten a dog. She was a protective and loyal dog who usually behaved calmly around the house. But every now and then, she would do something strange. She would stand at the top of the staircase and stare into my bedroom. Her back fur would stand up and she would growl low in her throat, like she was warning something unseen. My mom remembers this happening several times. The dog would just stand there, stiff and tense, staring into my room as if something was there that no one else could see. Around the same time, strange things started happening with the appliances in the house. They would turn on or off randomly without anyone touching them. The toilet would flush on its own. The microwave would start running. The radio sometimes refused to turn off. At first, my parents assumed these things were just electrical issues. Houses sometimes have wiring problems that cause strange behavior in electronics. But the timing of it all made things feel a little unsettling. It was during this same period that I began having sleeping problems that have stayed with me my entire life. Again, I was very young then, so I don't remember most of it myself. But my parents told me what used to happen. In the middle of the night, they would hear me crying. They would come into my room to check on me and find me sitting up in bed, frightened. Whenever they asked what was wrong, I would tell them there were people in my room. But every time they checked, the room was empty. No one was there. This didn't happen just once. It happened repeatedly. It became so frequent that my dad began sleeping outside my bedroom door at night, just in case there really was someone coming into the house. He wanted to make sure we were safe. Whenever he did that, something interesting happened. I never woke up during those nights, but the dog sometimes would. The dog would suddenly start barking in the middle of the night, alert and defensive. My dad would get up, check the windows, look around the house, and even check outside. But he never found anyone. Eventually, that phase ended too. The strange events faded away, and the house became quiet again. Years passed without anything unusual happening. Then, when I was a preteen, another strange experience occurred. One of my friends got a Ouija board. Like a lot of kids our age, we thought it would be fun and a little spooky to try it. One afternoon, we were messing around with it in my house, asking silly questions and seeing what answers we would get. At some point, we asked the board if there was a ghost in my house. The board moved. It answered yes. At first, we thought it was just one of us pushing it without realizing it. That's usually what happens with those games. But then we asked what the ghost's name was. The answer spelled out Christopher. We asked more questions, the kind people always ask in those situations. How did he die? How old was he? What did he look like? The answers described an older man who had died at home. And then it said something that made my stomach drop. It said he liked to wear a black hat. I had never told my friend anything about my brother's imaginary friend. The moment I saw those words spelled out on the board, I felt a wave of fear run through me. I immediately told my friend to take the board out of my house and never bring it back. Later, I asked my parents again about the man in the black hat that my brother used to talk about. They were visibly disturbed by the connection, too. Not long after that, the dog once again started barking and growling at nothing during the night. For about a month, I had constant nightmares. Then, just like before, everything eventually went back to normal. Years passed again without any strange events. Then, shortly after I graduated from high school, one final experience happened that I still think about sometimes. My parents had gone on a trip to Peru for about 2 months. By that time, my brother had already moved out of the house, so I was home alone with the dog. During those weeks, my insomnia became much worse. Most nights, I slept only about 2 hours. The lack of sleep started affecting me. I began seeing things in the corners of my eyes, little movements that disappeared when I looked directly at them. Sometimes it looked like small, shadowy shapes hiding in dark corners of the room. At night, I started letting the dog sleep in my room because it made me feel safer. Several times, the dog would wake up suddenly, walk to my bedroom door, and stand there with her fur standing up. She would growl and snarl at the door as if something was standing on the other side. I was always too scared to open the door and check. Eventually, she would calm down and return to her bed as if nothing had happened. Then, one evening, just a few days before my parents were scheduled to return home, something happened that I will never forget. I was standing in the kitchen when I noticed my dog in the hallway. She was rigid, staring toward the far end of the hall. Her teeth were showing and she was growling intensely. The way she looked made it clear she thought something dangerous was there. I grabbed a large kitchen knife and slowly walked toward the hallway. I expected to find maybe an animal that had somehow gotten inside the house. But when I stepped into the hallway, I saw something else entirely. Standing at the far end of the hall was an old man wearing a black top hat. He was as clear as anything else in the room. For a moment, I just stared. Then panic took over. I ran back into the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and called my best friend to come over immediately. I know when I returned to the hallway a few seconds later, the man was gone. The dog had calmed down too. My friend came over and stayed with me for the rest of the evening. When my parents returned from their trip, my sleep slowly went back to normal, and the strange visions stopped. Nothing like that has ever happened again. But the memory of seeing that man in the black hat standing at the end of the hallway remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. When I was around 9 years old, I spent a lot of time taking horseback riding lessons. The place where I learned to ride was a quiet little stable outside town, surrounded by fields and dirt trails. Most days were simple and peaceful. The smell of hay and leather filled the air. Horses stomped softly in their stalls, and riders moved slowly around the arena practicing their lessons. My riding teacher was someone everyone liked. She was patient, calm, and had clearly spent most of her life around horses. Sometimes, while we were brushing the horses or taking breaks between lessons, she would talk about things happening in her family or funny stories about people she knew. Back then, I was a kid, so I didn't always pay close attention to the details of the stories adults told. Most of them just sounded like background conversation while we waited for the next lesson. But there was one story that stayed somewhere in the back of my memory. At the time, it didn't seem especially terrifying to me. I think I was too young to really understand how disturbing it actually was. It wasn't until years later that the story came back up in conversation with my mom. And suddenly, I realized just how creepy it really was. The story involved my riding teacher's sister. I believe her name was Nancy, though I might be remembering that part slightly wrong. What I do remember clearly is the situation she found herself in one ordinary day. Nancy had gone to a mall to run a quick errand. It was the kind of everyday task most people don't think twice about. She parked her car, went inside, finished what she needed to do, and eventually came back out to the parking lot. The mall parking lot was busy that day, and when she stepped outside, she had a little trouble finding her car. Anyone who has parked at a crowded mall knows how confusing those parking lots can be. Rows of cars stretch in every direction, and after walking through the stores for a while, it's easy to forget exactly where you left your vehicle. Eventually, she spotted the general area where she had parked. But when she got closer, she realized something else had made it harder to recognize her car right away. 2 large trucks had parked on either side of it. They were big enough that they blocked the view of her car almost completely from certain angles. From a distance, it just looked like 2 large vehicles sitting next to each other. Only when she walked closer between them could she finally see her own car sitting there. It must have been slightly frustrating, but probably not something that felt especially unusual at the time. She walked toward her car and prepared to leave. That was when a man approached her. According to the story, the man looked well-dressed and professional. He was wearing a long coat, the kind of coat someone might wear with a business suit. He had leather gloves on his hands and was carrying a briefcase. Everything about his appearance suggested that he was a professional heading somewhere important. He spoke politely and explained that his car had broken down nearby. He told her that he had an important meeting he needed to get to, and asked if she would be willing to give him a quick ride to the nearest train or bus stop. It was only about a mile away from the mall, so it would take just a few minutes. For many people, that kind of request might not seem especially alarming. He looked respectable. He spoke calmly. And he wasn't asking for a long ride. Nancy decided to help him. She unlocked her car, and the 2 of them got inside. But the moment the doors closed, something inside her changed. She later said she couldn't explain exactly why. Nothing obvious had happened. The man hadn't threatened her or said anything strange. But the second they were both inside the car together, she suddenly felt that something was wrong. A deep, instinctive feeling of danger washed over her. Her body reacted before her mind could fully understand why. She started sweating and felt a strong sense of panic building inside her chest. All she knew in that moment was one thing. She needed him out of the car. But she also knew she had already agreed to help him. Simply telling him to leave might cause confusion or even anger. So she thought quickly. The trucks that had parked on either side of her car were still there, making it difficult to see the traffic moving through the parking lot. She turned to the man and said she needed help getting out of the tight parking space. She asked if he would step out of the car and guide her while she reversed so she wouldn't accidentally hit another vehicle. The request sounded perfectly reasonable. The man opened the door and stepped out of the car. He walked behind the vehicle to help direct her out of the parking space. And the moment he did, Nancy acted. She quickly locked the doors. Then she shifted the car into gear and drove away. She didn't wait. She didn't explain. She simply left. The man was still standing behind the car when she pulled away and drove toward the exit of the mall parking lot. Once she reached the main road and eventually the freeway, her heart was still racing from the decision she had just made. But as the minutes passed, another feeling slowly began to replace the fear. Guilt. She started wondering if she had made a mistake. Maybe the man had truly needed help. Maybe she had overreacted to a feeling that didn't mean anything. After all, he had seemed polite and professional. She began to imagine how frustrated or confused he must have felt standing in that parking lot after she suddenly drove away. The more she thought about it, the worse she felt. Then she noticed something sitting on the passenger seat. It was the man's briefcase. He must have left it there when he got out of the car to guide her out of the parking spot. At first, this made her feel relieved. Now she had a way to find him again. Maybe there would be a name, an address, or some business papers inside the briefcase that could help her track him down and apologize. She decided to pull over on the side of the road. She reached over and picked up the briefcase. Then she opened it. Inside there were no documents, no folders, no business papers. The briefcase was almost completely empty, except for two things: a roll of duct tape and a length of rope. The moment she saw those items, the realization must have hit her all at once. Whatever instinct had told her to get that man out of her car had probably saved her from something terrible. There was no innocent reason for someone heading to a meeting to be carrying rope and duct tape inside an otherwise empty briefcase. After hearing that part of the story, the image of that briefcase stuck with me. At 9 years old, I didn't fully understand how serious the situation might have been. But years later, when my mom reminded me of the story, it suddenly felt much more chilling. Because sometimes the most terrifying moments in life are the ones where something bad almost happened. And the only thing that stopped it was a gut feeling that told someone to act quickly before it was too late. Sixth grade was supposed to be the year everything felt new in a good way. New building, new lockers, new classes. It was the official start of middle school, and everyone talked about it like it was a big step up. But for me, sixth grade wasn't hard because of the change. It was hard because of what happened that year. A lot of things happened, but one day in particular still sits in my chest like a weight. It started in a way that seems small when you describe it out loud. In one of my classes, I had been assigned to write a paper. I don't even remember the topic anymore. What I remember is that I wrote it in pencil. I always liked writing in pencil because I could erase mistakes. It felt safer somehow. I had the paper with me during algebra one day because we had some free time at the end of class, and I figured I'd get ahead on my work. My homeroom teacher happened to be in that algebra class at the time. I was sitting there quietly, focused on my paper. No one was bothering anyone. Then, without warning, she walked over and took my paper out of my hands. At first, I thought she was just going to look at it. Maybe she wanted to check my progress. But instead of saying anything, she turned around and walked out into the hallway with it. I froze for a second, confused. Then I got up and followed her. She was standing in the hallway holding my paper above her head. It felt like one of those moments when someone teases a dog with a toy, keeping it just out of reach. She held it high, just high enough that I couldn't grab it easily. I jumped a little trying to reach it. She lifted it higher. I felt embarrassed because other people were nearby. I didn't understand what was happening. I remember feeling frustrated more than anything. It was my paper. I had worked on it. I needed it. So I reached up and pulled her arm down, not aggressively, just enough to try to get it back. That's when everything changed. She immediately reacted like I had done something extreme. She said I had grabbed her. The tone shifted fast. It went from what felt like teasing to serious in a matter of seconds. I was sent to in-school suspension for putting hands on a teacher. It didn't matter that I was trying to get my own paper back. It didn't matter that she had initiated the situation. The decision was made. The suspension day happened to fall the day before my birthday. That detail still hurts a little when I think about it. After first period that morning, I was walking to my second class, which was the one where we were working on the paper, because it was close to my birthday. And because it was a small class of maybe 9 students, the teacher had made cupcakes for everyone. It was supposed to be a small, simple celebration. As I walked down the hallway, the vice principal stopped me. He told me I needed to go to the suspension room. I tried to explain. I told him it was my birthday the next day. I told him about the cupcakes. I don't know why I thought that would matter, but at 12 years old, It felt like it should. He gave me 10 minutes. I went into the classroom, sat down, and tried to enjoy those 10 minutes. I didn't even really taste the cupcake. I was just watching the clock. Then, exactly 10 minutes later, the vice principal walked into the classroom again. This time, he had the security guard with him. That part confused me. I hadn't caused a scene. I wasn't running. I wasn't yelling. But the presence of a security guard made it feel like I was dangerous. They escorted me to the suspension room. The suspension room was quiet in a way that didn't feel calm. It felt tense. As soon as I walked in, I noticed signs posted all over the walls in large, bold letters. No talking. All caps, repeated everywhere. I sat down and started working on another assignment. I was trying to keep my head down and just get through the day. Then my pencil broke. It snapped right in the middle. I looked around for another one. I didn't have one. Normally you'd just ask, but those signs were everywhere. No talking. So I sat there. I didn't know what the rule was for situations like that. I thought if I spoke, I'd get in trouble for breaking the rule. So I waited. After a few minutes, the woman supervising the room snapped at me, asking why I wasn't writing. I told her my pencil broke. She scolded me and asked why I hadn't said anything. I remember pointing at the sign on the wall. It felt almost ridiculous. The rule was written clearly. No talking. I was following it. Instead of understanding, she seemed annoyed. A little while later, the bell rang for lunch. I stood up automatically, because that's what you do when the lunch bell rings. She told me to sit back down. Suspension lunch wasn't until the next period. I hadn't known that. I sat back down, feeling more and more small. Eventually, students who had lunch detention came into the room. They were allowed to eat. I wasn't. I was hungry. My stomach was tight, and I felt that uncomfortable mix of hunger and anxiety. My feet started sweating inside my shoes, which sometimes happens when I'm stressed. So I slipped my shoes off under the desk to cool down. The suspension supervisor called the security guard for taking off my shoes. That moment stands out because of how unreal it felt. I wasn't being disruptive. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was just trying to get comfortable in a stressful situation. But the response was escalated like I had done something serious. From there, things escalated further. I won't go into every detail because some parts are still hard to talk about. They're personal. They're the part that stuck with me long after the day ended. Eventually, the school decided to send me home. My brother came to pick me up. The car ride was quiet. I felt numb. When we got home, my parents asked what happened. At first, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't want to tell them, but because saying it out loud meant reliving it. After I calmed down, I told them pieces of the story. Their faces shifted from confusion to disbelief. They couldn't understand how something that started with a paper could spiral into something that felt so big. A few days later, my dad called the principal and asked for an incident report. He wanted to understand exactly what had been documented. He wanted to see the official version of events. The principal told him he didn't feel comfortable giving it to him. That sentence stuck with me almost as much as the rest of it. I didn't feel comfortable in that room either. But that didn't seem to matter. On another call, the principal said he would provide the report after Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving came and went. My dad called again. This time, the principal said he had received the report on the very day of my suspension, which had been over a month earlier. The contradictions added another layer of frustration. As a kid, you're told that adults in authority are fair, that if something goes wrong, there will be clarity. But that year taught me something different. It taught me how powerless you can feel when the system is stacked in a certain direction. The personal parts of what happened that day are the ones that linger. They're the reason I don't tell the story often. It's not about the cupcake or the pencil or even the shoes. Oh, it's about how quickly a situation can escalate when you're young and don't know how to defend yourself in the right way. 6th grade wasn't hard because of middle school schedules or lockers. It was hard because I learned what it felt like to be misunderstood and not believed, to be treated like a problem instead of a kid. Even now, years later, I can picture the suspension room clearly. The signs on the wall, the broken pencil in my hand, the security guard standing in the doorway over something so small. Some people might hear this and think it sounds minor, but when you're 12, your world is smaller. Moments hit harder. Authority feels absolute. Being escorted by security, being denied lunch, being spoken to like you're dangerous. It imprints on you. What stays with me most isn't anger, but it's the memory of feeling alone in a room full of adults. And even now, when I think about that year, it's not the classes or the lockers I remember. It's that day. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.